how do you describe your work?
I don't. Well, I'll describe it in different slivers of context, I think, just because I have an interest in a lot of different styles of music. I think that's what drew me to the turntable in the first place, is I always felt it was kind of a chameleonic instrument that could fit in and morph and work equally well in a live band context as it does as a solo thing, or in the realms of hip hop, and then also in the realms of just sonic ambience and things like that. So I mean, we really have to start with which record you're talking about, or which which era you're talking about, and then I can go from there. But I mean, it's kind of like a for me, I do attach myself to the turntables. That's the instrument I've spent the most time with.
Mm,
But I think, yeah, it's just been an adventure for the last 30 years, just
yeah.
seeing where it can go.
I mean, I asked the question for that reason because I know you have really run the gamut with that instrument.
Mhm.
And I'm curious if these various styles that you've explored, is it simply the instrument that pulls them all together, or is there something more? What's the connective tissue in your
Restlessness?
It's a
I
hell
don't
of
know.
an impulse.
I was born into a non-musical family.
Mm,
By that, well, that's not true. My grandmother actually sang Chinese opera, but I never heard her, so I guess that doesn't count. But my parents are non-musicians, but my father, they love music, but they didn't play any instruments or anything like that. And they felt when we were growing up, it was my father's dream that his children would at least learn how to play some form of music. um, Basically, that got iterated in the piano, early piano lessons from when I was 4, and so I had some classical training from when I was 4 to about 12, 13. That was my pretty much my only musical experience in playing. But what I was listening to was also all the jazz music my father would listen to, all the uh, score film score music that my mom would listen to, and folk music that she would listen to. And so I grew up around it, but not playing it. I guess it wasn't until um, my I was 12 or 13 that I discovered this whole turntable scratch scene, and that really, by contrast to my classical training, which is quite strict and quite, I would say, goal oriented, in terms of it was always leading up to an exam or an adjudicated, you know,
yeah.
concert or something, competition or something. Here was this scene where people just making the raddest sounds, in my opinion, off this instrument that I hadn't, ever heard before. And but I think what I did recognize about it was that it was a very tactile instrument. It was very uh, analog, and it was very it required some level of skill, and that was the part that was interesting to me. I could tell by the way the DJs were cutting up a phrase and stuttering certain syllables and creating a new pattern, that they were playing this live and that they had practiced to do this, and that was just endlessly intriguing to me. And so that was my entry point into it. And it was kind of a slingshot of being a little bit uh locked in with my classical music training and needing to see something else. And you're just at that age, for me, 12, 13, trying to sink your teeth into some scene that you can, really push yourself on. And for me, that, I mean, push your experience on, in terms of like, you know, testing yourself to see if you can learn something and grow with it. And so for a lot of my friends, it was skateboarding or sports, but for me, it was like 100% scratching. That's it. That's all I wanted to do, like, all day.
Who were the DJs that inspired you at that in those early days?
Oh, well, this would have been the late 80s. So I would say DJ Jazzy Jeff, Mace from from De La Soul, Prince Paul, Daddy Rich, Mr. Mix. Yeah, anybody who at the time that was the place that I could hear scratching was just on records.
Mm.
So a lot of the albums from that era, De La Soul, uh, Public Enemy, those records just for someone who just grew up listening to classical music and the jazz music that was playing, vocal jazz music that was playing in the house, it was, what is this? This is amazing.
Even the hip hop that preceded that period, the turntableists were fairly fundamental, fairly rudimentary, right?
Hmm.
It was a real leap forward, I think, in the mid to late 1980s in terms of what
Hmm.
the DJ brought to that mix.
Yeah. Yeah. From that entry point, I kind of had to go forward, follow it forward, and go back and do my research and figured, oh, okay, this song on this De La Soul record, what record were they sampling to make this happen? Or Prince Paul, how were they flipping this? And of course, that slowly brought me back towards the pioneers of all of it. The Cool Hercs and Grand Wizard Theodore and DST and Grandmaster Flash. And but at the time, yeah, you have to know, like, I was in Vancouver, I was 12, 13. I wasn't old enough to go to clubs. There weren't any block parties. So my only exposure that I had to scratching was what I could find at the record store. And
Mm.
which I would buy with my paper route or lawn mowing money or whatever I could, scrape together. I was like, spend it all on new hip hop records that were coming out at the time. And it was an exciting time just to as a fan,
Yeah. Yeah,
every
it
week there'd
was.
be a new record. You'd be like, oh no, it's crazy. It's so crazy what's happening here. Yeah.
Yeah, it really was. And so you start to practice, you start to learn the craft, but you're in Vancouver.
Vancouver,
How
and then
does?
I moved to Maryland for
Mhm.
the last part of high school. And I did, yeah, I spent a lot of time just practicing and trying to, experimenting, trying to figure out how some of the sounds were being made, but also just trying my own little sonic experiments to see what would happen. A lot of it was just what I had access to. So I destroyed my father's record collection first. But and then after that I was digging, started digging in, Salvation Armies and thrift stores and flea markets and just trying to find old dusty records to just play around with.
How much of it for you, looking back, was excuse me, was the love of the beat and the music, the club culture associated with the music,
Right. That's interesting.
versus the sample and the experimentation, as you put it, which is quite a
I
whole
would
thing.
yes, the beats were definitely a hook for me in terms of just the pure energy that was there. But I didn't come from block parties or nightclub because I was 12, 13, 14. I had some friends that started breaking and stuff, and a couple friends that started DJing also, but it wasn't, I think what informed my approach to it at the time was, um, again, just sort of what I had access to, whatever equipment or records I found. And I did start finding, probably because of Cold Cut, because of, you know, Grandmaster Flash, because of um, Prince Paul's work, especially the idea of finding these sort of interesting little spoken word bits and patching them together to tell a new story. I remember that track, Three's the Magic Number from De La Soul, just the whole third verse, which is all turntables, was just mind blowing. Or Mr. Mix, he had a track called Mr. Mix on the Mix. It was on the first Two Live Crew record, and it was just a solo turntable record where he did the verses, then the choruses, the verse, and it had this form, but it was basically him telling a story with the scratches. and Grandmaster Flash and Wheel of Steel, Cold Cuts, Beats and Pieces. Those tracks were just the ones that got me digging for for anything that would catch my attention. Just like, oh, that could be flipped well, or that would be kind of surprising if you threw that in the mix. And I would say that the beat was there, but I would say if you looked at my record collection, the amount of drum breaks I have records that I use to just juggle drums and stuff versus my spoken word and educational record side. I mean, it pretty much eclipses any other section of my record collection, just because over time, I guess I became a bit of a connoisseur of, of those types of records, just trying to find records that I found entertaining. Like, I didn't know why they existed in the first place. Like, some were meant to be played for your parrot, to train your parrot how to talk. Like, literally a piece of vinyl that was never meant to be heard by human ears. And I just got into the sort of backstory of it and enjoying the fact that A, that the record exists, B, that somebody thought there was a market for that, C, then I start thinking about the actual person who's narrating on that parrot training record and their life. And I kind of butterfly effect my way back into how did this person end in a vocal booth reading this word, over and over again, that eventually be played for a parrot. And I don't know, I just like how all those dots would connect in my mind. But I think the other main influences for that were storybook records. That's my first records that I grew up listening to, little 7-inch storybook records. Also, shows like The Muppet Show or Monty Python's. And now for something completely different, that idea of sometimes non sequitur, but still made sense in its own demented universe kind of way. Like, I really just loved all that stuff when I was growing up.
How big is the collection now?
Uh, each one of those, probably about 10,000 records,
Mm.
of which I've listened to every second of them.
Wow.
And some of them several hundreds of times. If they end up in my actual touring crate, then yeah,
Mm.
those are the records that I'm most fluent with, where even if the needle skips 3 grooves or something, that I could recover and figure out, where I am.
How many
But
records do you take with you?
nowadays, about 200 for a show. I have a very short attention span. I don't know if you've seen me DJ
Mm.
live before, but it's yeah, kind of sometimes like the records themselves are just I might just need 1 or 2 seconds of it, and it's something that I layer in or juggle in and make a new pattern of whilst the third turntable is playing a backbeat or something. So it's not like each record I would play for long. Some of them, yes, you might let the whole track run, but often, I don't know. The art of layering it and telling a story with it is kind of the part I'm most interested in.
What is it about a given sample that inspires you, or is there no one thing? What turns you on about a piece of sound?
I think it's interesting. I think first it's exactly that sound. How does it sound? um, I remember once, just as an exercise, I started collecting anytime I heard a cough or sneeze or something on a record. I just thought that was oddly delightful, and I would mark it down. I eventually made a track called Flu Season, just because I had accumulated all these sneeze samples and I didn't know what to do with them. Um, but the idea of it, like, just being something that catches your ear, uh, the tone of a voice, or for me, I think, again, we're talking about eras. So maybe if we're talking about the first 3 albums that I did for Ninja, it was very much about spelunking through the caves of vinyl and finding the oddest things that I could find to tell a personal story, if that makes any sense. And so, why, a bit of spoken word that would that was meant for a certain context, but then resonated with me where I was at in my life at the time, which was kind of a nervous 20 something, just branching out of school and trying to, do music professionally or something, and feeling all that pressure and not really knowing what to do in a studio yet. And um sometimes I would hear things that would kind of, oh yeah, that's actually how I feel right now, and then that would be something I'd be most excited about you um bringing into the mix, because I felt like, oh, I wasn't singing or writing a poem and or anything like that. It was like if I had to say something, it would have to be through Frankensteining little bits of sentences together that I found. And hopefully after listening to that, I'm not sure. I actually don't know if people would catch that, or whether they just thought they were weird samples or something. But I think a lot of them would resonate to me on a, one or at least two levels. On the one, the sonic side of it, and on the second, like just if it was a metaphor for something else, or how I was feeling or something like that. So I
Nice.
remember one bit was like, and that of course is what he deserved for pretending to be a musician when he was only a butcher or something like that. That was like back in the carpool. It was exactly how I felt. I didn't feel I was ready to be in the running in the industry yet. I was just getting started. So yeah, you find your ways to like get through your angst somehow. And for
Somehow,
me, it
yeah.
was like through bits of vinyl.
I'm
Yeah.
curious about your process. And is there a difference between beat-oriented work and non-beat oriented work? Do you go at the excuse me, do you go at the ambient work differently?
Yeah, so you're talking about, say, a
Music for
12-bit
drama.
blues versus music to draw to?
Right.
Right. Yeah, I think, again, context would be mostly what I would consider like the prime guiding light whilst recording any of those projects. Um, if you wanna know why Carpal is so not beat heavy, I mean, there are beats on there, but none you can dance to really, unless you're, a contemporary dancer or something like that. But I think in terms of the classical idea of like, oh, this is a groovy banger beat that would work on a huge sound system. The reason why Carpool wasn't that, I think, was because I made it on headphones. I had lived in a small apartment. My neighbors, I didn't want to keep them up. I was again listening to hundreds and hundreds of spoken word records all day. So that diet of that would eventually come out in weird dialogue-y, track like Bar Hopper or Fender Bender or something, where it became like its own narrative. Um, I think the context of that was I didn't have a crowd of people on a dance floor staring at me, waiting for me to play something for them to dance to. Instead, I was just, lost in the universes of all these, like an ocean of spoken word records and weird sounds and this and that. And I just had to try to make sense of it where I was. Um, and I think as I started touring with Ninja Tune, that was a bit of a Jekyll and Hyde kind of thing, where in the clubs I would know what to play and I would know how to freak it so that it kept the crowd moving. But then when I was at home, I almost wanted the opposite of that experience in the studio. So I just didn't. Maybe if there was a cutout of an audience full of people and I just put it on the wall. Honestly, that would have been it. But really, it was just like me staring at a bunch of spoken word records, going like, "What am I going to do with all this?"
Mm.
And but later, as I started getting kind of deeper into learning about production and things, um, it 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 still became about the context of what was this music, like the purpose of it for me. How how would I want to use it, in terms of, is this a good driving record, is this a good record for the gym, is this a good record to motivate you to clean your house, or is this a good record to just chill out to and like kind of get into a creative space? um I personally have my listening records sorted that way. I have what I call like drawing records that are probably too boring to play, when you have people over for dinner. They're a little too like slow and like moody and stuff. But for me, if I'm just at the drawing board working on a comic book or something, it's exactly that. And I realize, oh, I have all these records that I love, um, but they kind of serve this at least in my life, I go to them and they're very comforting records to have on when I'm trying to get in a certain zone. And
Yeah.
similar with beat stuff. So say with Floor Kids, it was like, okay, this is a hip hop b-boy breakdance battle animated, you know, game for Nintendo Switch. How are we gonna score that? What's that supposed to sound like? And then I had to draw from, experience from playing at break battles and just beats and just concentrating on the break first. So
Mhm.
that would guide that. Yeah.
There's a real sort of intuitive and almost emotional sense
Mm,
to what you're describing, that you're very much driven by how you're feeling, the mood you're
mm.
in, where you're at,
The
physically,
weather.
wise, the weather, like all
Are
of
you are
the,
you in Canada?
oh yeah,
So I mean, Montreal, 5-month winter.
yeah, yeah.
I can feel it coming on in terms of like, oh, I'm starting to see more turtlenecks and kind of parkas being worn, and I can just see like the drum machines in my studio start to be like pushed slightly further, and kind of the more bleepy ambient drony
Yeah,
bits of
yeah.
gear start kind of moving through. I don't know. It just felt like tapping into that hibernative energy that the whole city has at the time.
Mhm.
It felt like just the the more uh, timely thing to do in those seasons.
How does Storyville Mosquito fit into that?
Oh wow. Well, here's the thing. That's Storyville Mosquito was a project I started in 2003, right after Newphonia was released. That at the time there was an album that came out that fall. Some of my best friends are DJs, and I'm just gonna go back and tell you a bit of story about how that record started. Was because while I was growing up, my father was a fan of vocal jazz music, especially. But he told me specifically when I started traveling with my profession. He said, "Hey, if your tours ever take you to New Orleans, make sure you take some time and just go see the musicians there do their thing." And he specifically said Preservation Hall because of his experience when he was in college. He was up here in Canada and he went down to New Orleans. It was almost like a it was like a walkabout into this music that he'd been listening to all the time. He'd never seen it performed in that way, and so for him, it was just almost a spiritual thing. So he told me if I ever did that, I should you know spend extra time, which I did. So I had booked the gigs in New Orleans, and I said I'm going to spend another week there and just check out as many bands and clubs as I could, and including Preservation Hall. And was, yeah, just like my father had promised. It was just this whole part of music that I'd heard and been listening to like my whole life, but just seeing it played in a venue with no PA system, just people breathing into their instruments, and everybody in the audience just either singing along or just it was just there. It was just so it was paradigm shifting essentially. And I left every band that I saw would play a version of Basin Street Blues at one point in their set. And so I I was at the airport after that week flying home, and I said, I don't know what my next album's going to be, but the first thing I'm going to try is to do like a turntable version of Basin Street Blues. And and I'll be the first to admit that it's not actual jazz, my version. Because it took me months to find the parts and then practice and learn how to bend them into the lines I was hearing. And it was done layer at a time. So drums, bass, trombone, clarinet, trumpet, record, just scratching. Um, but it was me just, I don't know, it was just kind of studying really and figuring out how's that magic. And I know the magic is that everybody's playing all at the same time and they're playing and trying to stay out of each other's way and this and that. But I'd never had that experience, I was either solo DJing or playing in a band, which wasn't playing New Orleans jazz necessarily. But I did do that track. And yeah, in a way, I kind of feel like I'm a bit of an outsider of that whole
Sure.
scene with a deep love for it. But strangely enough, I think a few months later, maybe 6 or months or a year after the album had come out, we get a call from Ben Jaffe, who's the music director at Preservation Hall, and he said, "Hey, we saw this video you did of Basin Street Blues, the animated video, and your turntable version, and we think you really like captured something, or you get it, or something, and I want to invite you down to play at the hall." And I said, "What? You're Preservation Hall. You're supposed to preserve the traditional jazz, and he says, "No, no, no, like, I think you understand something about it, and I want you to show, you know, the older generation what, your take on it, because maybe they haven't been exposed to that." And I think, there's anyways, I was obviously super flattered, and I was yes, we're gonna totally do this. But I will tell you, I've never been that nervous in my life to play a show. And that room is 80 people, like I said, with no PA system or anything. But um I remember speaking to the band before. I was like, "Were you guys nervous the first time you played here?" Like this. They said, no, as as soon as you're old enough to blow a whistle or like tap on a tin can or something, you're in the marching band. And that kind of that whole attitude towards music is, yeah, it's just what I needed to hear even at that point in my life, just because prior to that it was all competitive classical music, or battling in a DJ battle, or the kind of uphill battle trying to like swim upstream in an industry when your music's not like mainstream. And all of a sudden just hearing this, like, no, 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 this is just what we do. There's always people that are better than you. There's always people that are not as good as you. Your job is to learn from the people before you, pass it on to the next generation, and then add your twist while you're here. And it just, I don't know, it felt like, why didn't I have this information when I was 5 years old?
It too, I guess, is just being in such a solo oriented style of music. That
Yes.
that notion of getting up with a band, learning with a band, learning your
Yes.
craft around other people who would support you in the way you're describing.
Yeah,
That's a different thing.
totally. It just, I was like, oh, I didn't know music could be approached that way. Like, you didn't have to think about it like from a technical side. You didn't have to think about it from you just play your story, as Charlie Gabriel would say. Like, what does that mean? Prior to that, I was like, when I was 5 years old, learning scales and everything. No, play this scale exactly like this. If you don't do it this way, you're going to lose points and disgrace your teacher and all this stuff. But you know, that whole thing, that whole experience literally changed my life. And I feel like that one night of playing on that stage, I learned more about playing music than I had like for decades prior, just DJing, or you know, and it's, I still, treat it like, just remember it as this very big moment for me still. And how does that relate to Storyville Mosquito? Well, the Storyville Mosquito is a story about a mosquito who moves to the big city to try to join an orchestra. And yes, maybe he has some level of talent to a certain extent, but then he's not sure, if he's on the level or if he has experience to sort of hang. And I guess it was about that kind of story, about that kind of, idea of finding your voice and challenging unmet potential and all this stuff. Seated in that character is a lot of my own experiences, but that's sort of how it started. It does start from just being a fan of music and then trying to pick up an instrument. Oh well, we don't actually have that instrument in our ensemble. It was like, oh no, I picked the wrong instrument for the first 20 years of my career or whatever. But um yeah, I think those were the seeds of it. And it goes all the way back to my childhood
Love it.
somehow. Yeah.
Thanks for this, man. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah. Cool, cool.